May Jesus be praised, and onward with Mary. Holy evening to all of you, dear children. Welcome back to our usual long-standing appointment with the so-called Mars of Bellico. Bellico reminds us that we are in battle for the defense of sound doctrine. Grace, indeed, as I mentioned this morning, it is a grace to fight for good faith, to fight for the preservation of the deposit of faith, to fight for the church. It's a grace that all of us, of the small remnant we have received, I would say particularly, we ministers of the gospel, we priests. Tuesday Warfare. The seventh episode from my book, The False Church and Its Destiny, has arrived, reissued by Gamba Publishing, with the cover featuring Michelangelo's fresco of Christ the Judge, which is available. You can request it at the office or pick it up during our stops as we travel from Milan to China. From Lecce onwards, actually. I also wanted to remind you that tomorrow's meeting in Bergamo, as you know, has been postponed, while the ones that remain, so you can have time to organize yourselves. The nearest ones are next Saturday, the 12th of October, in Lugano, Switzerland. At the place you see, we can also remind you, here is the Sera Giorgi Meeting Center, Sagel, in Lugano. And then on Sunday, we are in Turin, and tomorrow we will probably also be able to tell you where we are in Turin. The schedule only changes in Lugano, starting from 6 o'clock in the evening, while in Turin, we return to the usual Italian time, which means we do it in Italy at 4:30 in the afternoon. Here then, you also see this new location, which we hope will accompany us for a long time. I am very honored because, as I said in recent days, we are in the month of October, dedicated to Our Lady of the Rosary. As you can see behind me, the Madonna of the Rosary of Pompeii, to whom I am very attached, the title Queen of the Most Holy Rosary, is precisely what sends me into ecstasy, because it reminds me of the victory of the Madonna. The seventh episode from this book of mine, as I was telling you, was published in 2017, so several years ago. And yet it is very current, in fact, as those of you who have already got it might have seen. I haven't added anything, and I haven't removed anything, except for adding just the preface, another preface to the book, to update it. Maybe in the next episodes we'll delve into it, the introduction, because it's important. We've seen various important topics that foretold the time of deception and apostasy we're experiencing, as I mentioned this morning in the column Saints and Coffee, and one increasingly wonders, while going through these books, but when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Luke 18:8. Jesus presented it as a provocation, or even, as I mentioned this morning, a prophecy. We see this cursed synod taking place in Rome, the second phase, where undisturbed, with the work in progress, the ongoing work, the Masonic Satanist Lodge advances the destruction of Roman Catholicism, not only bypassing the gospel. O foolish Galatians, St. Paul says, if even he were to come, O foolish Galatians, O foolish Unicum, O foolish Bergoglians, O foolish distracted, O foolish deserters. St. Paul says, foolish Galatians, how could you so quickly change the gospel I proclaim to you? There is only one gospel, says St. Paul, and even if an angel were to proclaim to you a gospel different from the one I have announced to you, let him be accursed, excommunicated in your eyes. Bergoglio came with his travel companion Fernandez and all the others, unfortunately, you know their names well, who they have practically are announcing a different angel, and the Galatians of our time have become melted ice creams. It's sad to say. But that's exactly the situation we're living in. That is, practically, not only is there a false church, which is the Church of Saint, the Church of Darkness, which is building a new creed, a new gospel that is opposed to that of Christ. On the other hand, there's the complete acquiescence, astonishing to say, of parish priests, bishops, theologians, cardinals, canon lawyers, because there's also, let me remind you, especially the canonical, juridical, legal issue of a Bergoglio who is not the Pope, and everything proceeds as if he were. Let me remind you that they did the same on the Titanic, and then they all sank. All right, today's episode tackles a very important topic, which is as follows. We are on page 110 of my book. I will no longer refer to the book published in 2017 to 2018, but to the one just released, which I repeat is available along with the latest editorial effort that we will soon begin to discuss, namely the first volume of my book on Giovanni. Eagle and Sun on John's Gospel, first 5 chapters. I was saying that I'm referring to the number of pages in the new edition, the one published and made available the day before yesterday. We are on page 110 and discussing the issue related to Eucharistic reception. The title for today, as you know, for this evening, is The Mass and Communion in the Hand. What prompted me to address this topic? Why address it? And where are we at? First of all, a priority had greatly accompanied me in my life as a parish priest. When Bergoglio, in his infinite mercy, relieved me on the very day of the announcement to the parish, I no longer addressed the issue. Why didn't I treat her? To be honest, the reason is simpler than you might think. Because someone asked me, but how come, having read this book, you speak with such passion about communion in the hand as a big issue and then it's not mentioned anymore? The reason is simpler than you might imagine, and it's this. Having been removed from the parish, I went to Little Nazareth. Piccola Nazareth is a community that has remained Catholic, a people faithful to the teachings of Christ and the Church, and therefore they have ended up taking communion all on their knees. I tell you this even before I attended the traditional Mass, the Vetus Ordo Mass, thanks to the document by Benedict XVI on the motu proprio, which I recall allowed the celebration of the traditional Mass without, thank God, needing to ask permission from the Masonic bishops in Italy. That's why Benedict did it. When I was a parish priest, the parishioners, many of whom are part of the small remnant that follows me, can therefore testify when I make these references to the past. One of my battles was to encourage the faithful not to receive communion in the hands as much as permitted. A real desecration for me, a sacrilege, especially because there was an American priest who did. I made a video with a black glove, placed an unconsecrated host on the glove, and then removed it. Has been able to show with rays how many tiny fragments remained on the glove, and then when the glove was moved a bit, how many fell off. The Church teaches that Jesus is present both in the whole and in the part, in the fragment. A continuous profanation. Then these dirty hands, these hands that give the sign of peace. I'm referring to the Novus Ordo Mass. We never know what others might have touched. They put money in the basket for the collection and then receive the Eucharist. And then you receive the Eucharist, not to mention the awkward choices during the lockdown, when at a certain point you saw the spray, those things there. Let's not go there because that's really where we reach the grotesque. But as a parish priest, I always urged the faithful not to receive communion in their hands, because I always felt it was a desecration, a victory of Satan through the Masonic Lodge. A couple of things over the years have confirmed this for me. I became a parish priest very young. Imagine, I was ordained a priest. As you know, it's been 25 years in a little while and a few months. Exactly in December. In December 99, December 27th, 99, I managed to serve about a year and a half as a vicar, and then Cardinal De Giorgi, in my opinion, mistakenly sent priests into the fray for pastoral needs. A 27-year-old shouldn't be a parish priest, I think. The parishes can wait, they are merged. Parishes need priests with at least 10 years of experience. Otherwise, the priests burn out. These bishops who send priests into the fray indeed carry on their conscience, the priests who then burn out and leave the priesthood, leaving with a woman if things go well. And I'll stop here, all right? Because they explode. Sadly, instead it should be, sorry for this aside, but I'm now 51 years old, I'm a shepherd, and I'm understanding things better and better, even if I'm kept like a plague on the fringes of everything. I don't mind, I'll carry on. I filled the hall in Milan with my fellow brothers last Sunday in the completely embarrassed silence of the media. I was saying that I, on the other hand, believe that a newly ordained priest must have the sacred time to study. Must study. There you have those unforgettable images from 2 days ago in Milan. The priest must study, must have time to read. The young priest must have space for frequent spiritual exercises, for periodic clergy meetings, must especially be able to study. Why not? Obtaining further academic degrees, specifically the license in theology, and even more, if possible, the doctorate, to precisely validate his work. What happens instead? At 26, 27 years old, I'm talking about my experience in Palermo and about fellow brothers, naturally dear to me because they are my peers, who then left the priesthood. One of the reasons is because they break down in the parish, because they are sent by parish priests at 27, 28, 30 years old, with 1, 2, 3 years of Mass, in parishes that are also problematic, as happened to me because I had peripheral difficult parishes. So to say that when I was sent as a parish priest, right from the start, even as a young man, I was 27 and a half years old. Imagine that. I became a parish priest in one of the most difficult parishes in Palermo, in Bocca di Falco, on the northern outskirts of Palermo. At 27 and a half years old, I don't know. Truly, the Madonna has always supported me. Also, because when I arrived, the faithful of Bocca di Falco, it seems like I have a star on my head, while... And yet, one of those of the Madonna is not a scenic effect. I came with the rosary and got to work. One of the first things I intended to do was to immediately invite, if the faithful of Bocca di Falco remember and are among the small remnant, invite the faithful not to take communion in their hands. Over time, confirmations arrived, and I want to mention just two because there are many. One is magisterial. It's a document from the Holy See signed by Cardinal Francis Arinze, an African. I believe he's still alive, almost a centenarian, or at least definitely in his 90s, prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship. In March 2004, just before the passing, a year before the death of John Paul II, this document was produced, naturally approved by the Holy Father, called Redemptionis Sacramentum, published on the 25th of March 2004. In this document, I was expecting a document that could provide clarity on this. Many priests had written to the Holy See to clarify what the Holy See thought. Now let me tell you, the decision to give communion in the hands is not made by the Holy Father, but by the National Episcopal Conferences. You should read, you see that the topic of communion in the hand brings with it many themes. You should read what von Balthasar, my mentor, Hans Urs von Balthasar, wrote in the late 1970s. He said that the Episcopal Conferences emerged as a true victory for the anti-church, Freemasonry, and the enemies of Christ, because he was right, he was prophetic, because prophecy can be exercised either through infusion or acquisition. Many times in my case, when you say to me, Father, but you're getting everything right, look, more often than not, it's not direct prophecy, it's acquired. I'm quite perceptive, as they say in Naples, so I understand things, anticipate them, sense them. Von Balthasar sensed that these conferences would become real centers of power. Let's think about Italian Episcopal conferences. Who becomes a bishop? Who are these people becoming bishops in the last 20 to 30 years? Unknown individuals, without charisma, lacking charm, whom people don't know. They don't even know who the bishops of the major dioceses are, many times, and above all, Masons. The Episcopal conferences have made the unexpected and, above all, unjustified decision to move from receiving the Eucharist on the knees, or at least standing but always on the mouth, on the tongue, to communion in the hands, with pretexts that are similar, as I mentioned this morning, to those concerning deaconesses, meaning there is always a maneuver behind it. Ideological, for instance, women should be deaconesses due to discrimination, needing to reach the altar, as they did in early centuries. Neither is true. It's all ideology. Communion in hands was ideology, as it was done early on, and Jesus did it at the Last Supper. I told a priest that in a clergy meeting I attended, he made this statement and I raised my hand. That's why I used my own techniques. With my fellow brothers, apart from a few exceptions, thank God, it has always gone not badly but terribly. I've always had to endure immense envy. Incalculable. Anyway, I told this priest in front of the bishop, then grow your hair, wear a habit, a linen cloth with sandals, like the apostles did in the time of Christ. Absolutely, there is no objective reason to switch from receiving communion, the Eucharist, on the mouth, on the tongue, or standing, even kneeling, to receiving communion in the hands. This document clarified this as the Holy See was consulted. The Italian, German, French, and English Episcopal conferences allow that. But you Vatican, you Holy See, you dicastery for these matters here, which is the liturgy? What do you say? What do you think? This document came out that the Pope approved. John Paul II. At chapter 4 in this document titled The Holy Communion, it discusses the conditions for receiving the Holy Communion. I refer you to that document because I want to talk about my book. The other aspect, well, the faithful of Bacca di Falco knew it, but then when I went to the other parishes, I got involved in this. So much so that in the transition from Cardinal De Giorgi, Archbishop of Palermo, to Cardinal Paolo Romeo, also Archbishop of Palermo, things got worse for me. De Giorgi tolerated me because he was a man of conscience, and above all, tied to tradition. Romeo, on the other hand, found out about this matter and sent the auxiliary bishop to me. Imagine that. Just think about how it works. He came to conduct some sort of investigation. The auxiliary bishop, because I didn't give communion in the hands, and there were progressive people, these Bergoglians, before the event, who went to the bishop to complain because I didn't give communion in the hands. And every time I referred to this document from the Holy See, I don't engage in debates with the bishop because he would tell me, but we Italian bishops, I am the bishop of your diocese, you must obey. I was saying, Eminence? Excellency, I'm talking about the auxiliary bishop. Look, there's a document from the Holy See, which is a higher authority than the Episcopal conferences, so you can't impose this on me, and I'm not being disobedient at all, because a document from the Holy See, like the Redemptionist Sacramentum, published on the 25th of March, 2004, authorizes communion to be given on the tongue and kneeling. Yes, on the tongue and kneeling. In a moment we'll see why, because the document clearly states how the Eucharist should be received, and this overrides the Episcopal conferences. It was a shock, and this unfortunately showed, dear children, you must know that there are topics that have remained hidden. I talk about them in my books. Perhaps it was my vocation that God entrusted to me to speak to you about things that have remained alive, true for years, but hidden and practically underground. This was an unexpected blow that demonstrated the tension between the Holy See and the Episcopal conferences, at least during the times of Wojtyła and Ratzinger, that is, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. The Episcopal conferences, including the Italian ones, went their own way, disregarding the Roman Pontiff and the Holy See. Here the Holy See intervened during the fervent battle to give communion in the hands, which led the satanic sects to continue rejoicing. However, the document states in number 90 that the faithful receive communion kneeling or standing as established by the Conference of Bishops and confirmed by the Apostolic See. When, however, they receive communion standing, it is recommended that before receiving the sacrament, they make the appropriate reverence as established by the same norms, that is, bow their head before the Blessed Sacrament. So the Holy See reiterated in the face of interference from the Episcopal conferences, which wanted, as Masonic lodges, the Episcopal conferences are Masonic lodges, communion in the hands. The Holy See stated that the only way to receive the Eucharist is kneeling and on the tongue. 91. In the distribution of Holy Communion, it should be remembered that sacred ministers cannot deny the sacraments to those who request them appropriately, are properly disposed, and are not prohibited by law from receiving them. I'm sorry I didn't have the time, I'm traveling, I apologize to you. Many, unfortunately, are the images on social media videos of cardinals and bishops scattered around the world, from Latin America to Europe, where when they appeared, the faithful, even today, are made to kneel by these priests, these bishops, and these cardinals, committing a truly serious act of abuse, for which they should, if the situation were normal, but now we are at the grotesque, be reported to the Holy See. The Chilean cardinal, I can't recall his name, perhaps in Santiago, Chile, during the season of Benedict XVI, denied communion to a believer who wanted it on their knees. Well, a genuine campaign was launched to accuse him, as was right from the Holy See, of abuse. He can't deny communion to those who kneel and ask, as the Holy See says so. I repeat, of these campaigns that I was passionate about in past years, I no longer had any reason to do so, because, as I told you, at Little Nazareth and then around with the new mission of the small remnant, no one has ever dared to come and ask for communion with those hands placed there, which seemed to be a real act of defiance to God, to the real presence of the Lord. I haven't talked about it anymore because, thank God, it hasn't been our problem anymore, even in the rediscovery, as you know, of the traditional Mass, where it's absolutely unthinkable. And for this you must give praise. Praise the traditional Mass where hand communion is unthinkable, but the Holy See stepped in 2004, clarifying the situation. Director? Didn't get it. Thanks to the team for telling me Bishop Celestino's name. Thanks to the team, this is a big help. Often I repeat, travel leaves no time, but this proves I'm not making it up. The production team noted the Chilean Bishop Celestino shares a name with our brother Celestino. So the document states that it is not permissible to deny a believer Holy Communion, for the simple reason that they wish to receive it kneeling, etc. In contrast, we also see priests around, of course. There are no images. But in the false church, as it is now, the poor faithful who convince themselves that it is still the Catholic Church and that the Lord's presence is there, go and often get scolded because the priests do not give them communion on their knees or impose it in their hands. This is a real abuse. Then there are other passages that, thinking of the Mass celebrated on the air mattress at sea, give you chills. Number 91 in the situation of Holy Communion is to be remembered. I read this, number 92, although every faithful always has the right to receive Holy Communion on the tongue, says the document if there are norms that establish it cannot be received in the hands. The document states that confirmation from the Apostolic See is required. It is truly a firm stance by the Holy See regarding the Episcopal conferences. The document was practically censored, in fact. No advertisement was made for this document, for obvious reasons. And there's the passage I memorized and reiterated to my bishop when he sent the auxiliary bishop's inspection as if he were committing a liturgical abuse. I said, "Eminence, you abuse." I quoted this passage. The document states, if there is a risk of desecration, the Holy Mary should not be distributed into the hands of the faithful. When I became priest at St. John Bosco, the parish, much more populous than Bocca di Falco, the third parish, with several thousand parishioners, always full. In practice, it ended up that the bishop knew I didn't give communion in the hands on Sundays. The bishop called me and told me that this was strictly forbidden. Watch the video, yeah. I was saying, I told the archbishop that he was the one committing this abuse by calling me to reprimand me. I quoted this passage from memory. Why say, why not give communion in hands? Eminence, there is the document at number 92, Sacramentum Revision, which, until proven otherwise, is above you. The Holy See intervenes and states that if there is a risk of desecration, Holy Communion should not be distributed in the hands of the faithful. I see risk giving communion in hands, so Holy See protects me. And already practically the feather's in the bag, then I paid for it in other ways, naturally. Then document number 93 states that it is necessary to maintain the use of the paten for the communion of the faithful to prevent the sacred host or any fragment from falling. Now the control room shows the image I mentioned. It makes you think. No sound, so I'll show you. Here in Santiago, Chile, look what's happening. He doesn't give communion to people who want to receive it kneeling. It's a real abuse. If the team cooperates with me right away, we can show what happened during the Sunday celebration in Belgium with the false pope. There are the images. I cannot remain silent, the Facebook profile of Siler Non Possum, which commendably shared images of extraordinary ministers. Why can't priests do it? Why don't priests give communion, and why must extraordinary ministers give it on this occasion? You see the faithful giving it as if they were sweets, chocolates. In a moment we will see it. Yet the Holy See invites the use of the plate because fragments can always fall, even when we celebrate in these gatherings. One of the moments I care deeply about, my collaborators know, is to be very, very attentive to Eucharistic desecration. I mean, it can happen without fault or responsibility, that a host falls to the ground. Then you pick it up. I mean, this can unfortunately happen. It has happened to me several times. But not communion given as if they were chocolates and sweets. The moment of grace, the moment of faith that certainly cannot be bypassed. And then the document says other things that, of course, I'll spare you now. This was one of the fundamental reasons why later, when I wrote this book in 2017, as those from the early days might remember, straddling the removal from being a parish priest and the birth of the small remnant. So I still cared about this theme of communion on the tongue and on the knees, and thus in this book I addressed the topic. The topic also because, in addition to the document I mentioned to you, namely the Redemption of the Sacrament, I repeat, released on the 25th of March 2004, I read at that time, I believe providentially, the mystical visions of Maria Sima. Maria Sima is a woman who passed away a few years ago, Austrian, who received a special gift from God, the ability to speak with the souls in purgatory. One of the themes that the souls in purgatory have consistently addressed is the pain felt in heaven due to receiving communion in the hand. Maria Sima added some interesting things. That is, what struck me is that the bishops and cardinals, and the priests, especially bishops and cardinals, who have approved communion in the hands, even if they save their souls, meaning they don't end up in hell, they won't go to heaven, and will remain in purgatory until the Church intervenes to abolish this true and proper abuse of Masonic Satanist origin of communion in the hands. Unresolved issue, I think, of the conciliar liturgical reform. Now I'll read from my book, and then when the images of the Eucharistic procession are ready, you can broadcast them without me having to interrupt. It's the unresolved issue, I write, in my opinion, of the conciliar liturgical reform, all the more crucial as the establishment seems less inclined to address it. Now the issue, as if the false Bergoglian Church cares, not a bit. It's certainly not, I wrote in 2017, at the top of the concerns of the false church, and wherever it's discussed, the reaction is always the same. To label those Catholic realities, few but precious, that raise the issue as reactionary traditionalist circles, considering it at most as the discourse, the issue. An anachronistic and anti-conciliar theme, and yet the topic of communion in the hand must, I was saying, be urgently addressed as a priority in 2017, because Jesus is present there. First, remember, dear children, this is crucial. I don't need to urge you as you, the small remnant, thank God, don't take communion by hand. However, you must keep this in mind, I urge you. Remember that in the council documents, even when discussing significant innovations proposed in the liturgy, there is never any mention of communion in the hands. So communion in the hand is not at all, like others claim, a topic of the Second Vatican Council, a result, as traditionalists say, of the Second Vatican Council, not at all. A first glaring inconsistency. Who supports communion in the hand? They claim the council backs it, but it didn't. Actually, it almost seems that those who suffer from such a liturgical crime, as I call it, that of communion in the hand, for me is a liturgical crime, are like small dwarfs in front of a progressive and Masonic Gulliver, who, in the absence of direct quotes from the council, because thank God there are none, makes the practice appear as a return to the origins of the Christian liturgy. There's this need to return to the Church of the origins, because the Vatican Council is a new Pentecost. These are the images I was telling you about. Look closely. This is still the deacon. But there are lay people, you see, then stronger images. You must capture them. No, not these images. They'll show you soon. Perhaps more than any other issue, that of communion in the hand truly appears as the revelation of schizophrenia, because it presents as a conciliar theme something the Council did not concern itself with addressing. Our small remnant stance is clearer thanks to Bergoglio, Vigano, traditionalists, sedevacantists, etc. We have returned to the traditional Mass, not out of a nostalgic impulse that suddenly abolishes the Second Vatican Council and considers John Paul II and Benedict XVI as innovators like Vigano does. Never ever will Don Minutella do this. Then if you are not convinced, leave. We are with the Eternal Catholic Church, for which the Council, as Benedict XVI reminded us, is within the context of a hermeneutic of continuity, and thus we must indeed protect it, even if it was not dogmatic. As von Balthasar says, there was no true profession of faith, so it would be more than ever urgent, when things perhaps settle, to indeed call for a council. An ecumenical council in which the profession of faith is urgently renewed for today's times. The details of the approval of communion in the hands remain merely an indult of the apostolic see. When, for example, the Italian bishops, I went to do the research, but when did the Italian bishops, the Italian Episcopal Conference, approve communion in the hands? I discovered interesting things that, unfortunately, they make you laugh bitterly. When the Italian bishops, with only 2 more votes, so there was a split, many Italian bishops, including those from Sicily, thank God at that time, almost all the Sicilian ones, I believe all of them, did not want communion in the hand. There was opposition. The Italian episcopate was divided. Communion in the hand won by just 2 more votes and was approved. There were those who, as the president of the Episcopal Conference, evidently upset and worried, drafted an accompanying document. When communion in the hand was approved, then Cardinal Ugo Poletti wrote a concerned document. This, however, was revealing, in which it was said that at least the children who received it in their hands could find some basins of water in the corners of the parishes, where to purify the hands, because the child goes out and pees. The little boy, pees in the garden. These are things we know, right? Then he comes back, he's already had his first communion with hands stained with pee, goes to take communion. This is what Poletti wants to say, but one wonders why put water basins inside the parishes, as Cardinal Poletti proposed in a document of the Italian Episcopal Conference approving communion in the hands. It's almost as if we are forced to give this communion in the hands. It's clear that it was a way to show that we are forced. We are obliged to do it by the Masonic leadership. Unbelievable stuff. Instead of preventing the abuse, they were concerned with curbing the desecration from the start. The very generation of children raised Catholic in the 80s and 90s is what it is. Apart from the obvious countertrend, which I note here, of the traditional groups or the apparitions of Medjugorje in the 90s, it does, however, record a worrying casualness regarding the Eucharistic worship and adoration. If you talk, apart from exceptions, with young people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, unless they have been to Medjugorje, they haven't met holy priests, they know absolutely nothing about Eucharistic adoration, assuming they even go to church. The document in question, published by Cardinal Ugo Poletti, which for the first time authorized communion in the hands, is titled On Eucharistic Communion and dates from May 1989, followed by the decree of the Italian Episcopal Conference that contains it, dated 19th July 1989. Came into effect on the 3rd of December of the same year, 1989, the first Sunday of Advent. The text of the instruction on Eucharistic communion regarding this additional way of receiving the consecrated host explains, "Today, it seems particularly appropriate to approach the altar in procession, receiving the Eucharistic species while standing with a gesture of reverence, professing faith with the same spirit." Christ's sacramental presence. You understand that the Masonic method was already at play, which hasn't changed. It's what Bergoglio applies today. The mockery, the fooling, the deception of consciences. Coming there to receive the Eucharist, but why hold it in your hands as if it were a game? Look at how this young man took communion, please. This scout. Look closely, dear children, at what level we are. She takes it in her hands, observe. Thank goodness we don't believe that the Lord is there, because that is the false church of darkness. So, we were saying that it is an indult from the Holy See, for communion in the hand through the instruction Memoriale Domini promulgated by the Sacred Congregation for Divine Worship on the 29th of May 1969. As I was telling you, the Holy See allowed it because many have asked me why John Paul II and Benedict XVI did not allow it. They allowed it because they found a document that gave Episcopal conferences the option to request the faculty to introduce the practice of receiving communion in the hand, an option, not an obligation. In pastoral practice, as Freemasons know well how to act, it shifted from the option to receive in hands to a point where one takes it in hands, assumes responsibility, and must receive it in hands. Anyone who continued to want to receive on their knees and in the mouth was treated as an outsider from the church. Sometimes, to be honest, the attempt to initiate at least the discussion seems futile, because the interlocutor appears blinded. I wrote this in 2017, mind you. What unfortunately all of you now, with someone who is not the Pope, the false church, heresy, apostasy, a counter-gospel that goes against the word of Christ, communion in the hands, the divorced and remarried, the blessing of gay couples, and so on, you notice, you experience it, you suffer from it, that nothing, they are blinded, but I was already experiencing this in 2017. Sometimes it truly seems I write prophetically, like witnessing that blindness Paul mentions in his letters concerning the times of the great apostasy. Read Energia Plains, the power of deception. How often do you see priests refusing communion to those who wish to receive it kneeling, and even on the tongue? Even here, as with other sensitive issues, it seems that the training in seminaries has been so manipulated that it makes priests appear, it's regrettable to say, as executors of a Masonic program that cannot be discussed. I remember that we priests couldn't discuss these things. When some priests tied to tradition dared, and not the older ones, because paradoxically the older ones didn't even notice the change. Young priests were troubled, not a few parish priests, and hand communion. De Giorgi claimed the document from the Holy See for himself, and thus secured himself. But then Cardinal Romeo was one of those who evidently was keen to approve these rules. Who knows why? It's not trivial. This hand communion isn't trivial. For us, the small remnant, it is now. Thank God it's irrelevant. I said it at the beginning. That's why I haven't talked about it anymore. Since I'm tackling my book, The False Church and Its Destiny, published in 2017, you see it was a battle then, but not now as you all receive it on your knees. Meaning, if you go there, you won't know about your hands. What's the worry about hand communion? It's clear it's the desecration, like the ones we see in these images. Why the desecration? Because there is the real presence of Jesus. Look at what I write here, prophetically. I'm amazed. Perhaps I write on page 112 of the republished book, The Ostracism of the Current Government. Addressing the issue of abuses and serious crimes committed against the Eucharist is a symptom of the loss of faith in the real presence, which turns into a symbolic bread. I remember very well, maybe not you, but I do. Now I'll make you remember. That period when Bergoglio went, it was the early years. I believe it was 2017, though I might be wrong. But I remember the detail. He went to Switzerland. Returning on the plane, he was asked what can be done to achieve a mass between Catholics and Lutherans. You know that this is impossible unless the Lutherans convert, because we must speak of conversion. And this is not a joke, with all due respect to ecumenical dialogue. For this reason, anyone, I believe even John Paul II, cannot compromise for the sake of ecumenism. You can celebrate the Mass for a Lutheran and then give them communion if they convert to the real presence, because as you know, Luther did not believe in the real presence, and therefore neither do the Lutherans believe in it. The Lutherans believe in the symbolic presence, but there is a chasm between the real presence, meaning in that host there is Jesus, and the metaphorical presence, where Jesus is symbolized in that host. Luther, to be honest, spoke of consubstantiation, meaning that in the host remains the ember. Bread makes Christ present. But even here, it's a confusing way to argue because the Church speaks of transubstantiation, meaning the host transforms, a change of substance, and thus there is the real presence. So there's the real presence, all right? Then Lutherans can attend Catholic Mass, perhaps even approach the Eucharist, only if they convert to this indispensable dogma of Roman Catholicism, that is, that Jesus is present in the host, alive and true. Bergoglio, when questioned on this aspect, without any problem, then filed the matter away, thank God, spoke of intercommunion, which is a truly not only abusive, desecrating, profaning act, but a truly sacrilegious act. For Bergoglio, he has said it a couple of times, there would be no issues if it were decided to. One must understand whether Bergoglio is followed by everyone in the Vatican, then Rome has become the seat of the Antichrist, or if they let him play and then block him through decisive channels. I don't know because I'm not worthy, sir, that they would speak to me, but Bergoglio has said a couple of times that there would be no problem celebrating Mass with Lutheran pastors, giving Catholic communion, thus the real presence, to those who do not believe. After all, Bergoglio is the one, just in case you forgot, I have spoken about him several times and mentioned him in my books, who during a celebration, as the Bishop of Buenos Aires, indeed in Buenos Aires, went to a hospital and then distributed communion. These progressives, these Freemasons, you should know that they give communion to anyone. Last Sunday, when I arrived in Milan, a lady told me she needed to vent, and I greet her warmly. I believe she was from Milan, from the Milanese hinterland, and she told me she had attended a Mass, unfortunately for her, where the priest at one point told the congregation, come all to take communion, everyone, even those of you who are divorced, because Pope Francis has opened the doors. You get the slogans, but I do believe there's a real presence, or they'd be making amends all the time, dear children. Returning to Bergoglio, he went to this hospital to give communion to the faithful, to the Catholics in the hospital, and among them was a Jewish woman attending the Mass. Not understanding anything, since Bergoglio, like progressive priests do, gives it to anyone, he gave it to this Jewish woman who took it in her hands and then ate it. After the Mass, she approached, as Bergoglio tells it, he tells it, mind you, he tells it, I'm not making anything up. This woman approached to thank him and said, I am Jewish, what did you give me? And Bergoglio said to him, I gave her the Eucharistic bread. Ah, he says, but I don't believe in this, in real prevention. He laughed and said, yes, but you're of the same lineage because Jesus was Jewish, and you're Jewish too. So all in all, he has done it, an act for which he is already excommunicated, because in that case, when one does it, obviously as he did, I hope inadvertently, but if there is a recurrence, meaning if you don't ask for forgiveness having known it, you are excommunicated, late sententiae. These are important topics, dear children, but this is the era of total rudeness. Look at the Vatican, the world, the church, the media. It's hard to survive in this rude world. And as Max Schneider used to say, it's the time of banality, with trivialization elevated to an informative, disciplinary, and normative criterion. The banal becomes the incredible reality in the times we live in. A Bergoglio who, if what was told is true, and we have no reason to doubt it in this case, because of Bergoglio, there you see, I thank the director. The Pope communicates to a Jewish woman even what I gave you as a Jew. So he hasn't repented for this mistake, in case he did it inadvertently. Because Bergoglio, you must know that you should trust what he says when he speaks against Christ and against the church. Then he is sincere. For the rest, do not trust him. So he, the church, teaches the canons. The canons of the canonical concept stipulate that in this case, in the event of such profanation, there is abuse and sacrilege, and the church imposes excommunication latae sententiae. Bergoglio would therefore be excommunicated because he hasn't repented for what he did. In fact, he even laughed about it. It's not a legacy of the traditionalists, then, it's the central affair of the entire church. Before even worrying about the environment of 2017, ecology, or immigration issues, and who could have imagined they would later also deal with those things we hear about today. They should safeguard and protect the Eucharistic Lord with the love and fidelity that Saint Joseph had in protecting the child Jesus. Every priest, when distributing communion, during our gatherings, in our celebrations, as a priestly society, we do it, dear children, we are very careful to give communion in the right way. In the Eucharist, indeed, out of love for souls, Jesus makes himself vulnerable, like when he was a small infant targeted by Herod's murderous hatred. Imagine Saint Joseph placing the baby Jesus in the manger, then going off to discuss in the square of Bethlehem about herds, pastures, Roman invasion, and unjust taxes, while the unattended child is handed over to enemy hands. This aspect that I perhaps address too devoutly, look at what I wrote in 2017. Well, I would never have imagined this aspect that I address too devoutly has been defined by Monsignor Schneider as ius Christi, the right of Christ. This is lovely. Christ has a right to be received worthily. We congratulate Mr. Athanasius Schneider on this. Recently, while commenting on Schneider's insight, that is, the right of Christ to be received devoutly, Cardinal Burke, who would have ever imagined that shortly after he would call me to tell me to retire to a monastery, to live a life of penance, gratefully affirmed, recalling. And so these books that are available, I think you should at least have this one. They are a historical document that shows that I am not at all what they describe and portray me as. As you see, I was devoted to Burke, I was devoted to Schneider, only to then discover who they truly are and thus distance myself for the love of the flock, so that souls are not deceived. At that moment, however, Burke writes, reminding us of the complete humility of Christ's love given to us in the small host, fragile by nature. Monsignor Schneider draws our attention to the serious duty of protecting and adoring our Lord. Certainly, in Holy Communion, due to his ceaseless and immeasurable love for mankind, he becomes the smallest, the weakest, the most delicate among us. The eyes of faith recognize the real presence in the fragments, even in the smallest of the Holy Host, and thus lead us to adoration. Loving. Here I'll stop for today because the introduction was extensive, so we'll resume next week, God willing, as there's still much to delve into. In my book about this abuse and also about this profane act, which is communion in the hands that has been perpetuated in the church for years, now that false one. What to conclude? First of all, I would say that together we can thank the Madonna for pulling us away, albeit painfully, from what is the false church of darkness, to the small remnant. The first to be brought there was Don Minutella. Then gradually all of you came, priests, nuns, consecrated people, families, young people, elderly, men, women, children. We are the small remnant that has been able to discover the importance of the moment of Eucharistic reception. That is, when we receive Jesus and have a direct experience of Him, and we have a direct experience of His love. No longer our problem. Second thought, we think the Lord's absent there, as the devil acts there, and the Lord avoids where the devil is. That's Satan's church. Anyway, if he were present, you would need to, if you think about it, continuously make amends for the ongoing abuse that is common at hand. Third, I would like to tell you what I think for the future, which is that in a possible meeting between the Vetus and Novus Ordo, for me, as far as I'm concerned, otherwise I'll step aside, it will be essential to propose again, as tradition, for which we are grateful, dictates the Eucharistic reception in the language and on our knees, because it is the Lord who comes to us. And in the Gospels, everyone who encounters Jesus kneels down to worship Him. Thanks for listening. Remember, tomorrow won't be. The meeting scheduled in Bergamo is postponed, while those in Lugano next Saturday at 6 o'clock in the evening and in Turin on Sunday, the 13th of October at 4:30 in the afternoon are confirmed. I bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Praise Jesus. On with Mary.